Hello there, my name's Claire Haggett and I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Edinburgh. And I'm delighted to be speaking to you today from Scotland to wherever you are, talking about community benefits and the boundaries for communities when we're thinking about distributing the benefits and the impacts that come from offshore wind farms. So, plan for today is I'm going to talk just briefly through four things. Firstly, I'm going to talk about why community benefits matter and a concept that academics call energy justice. Secondly, I'm going to talk through how we might find communities for offshore wind farms, particularly thinking about some research we did in Aberdeen off the northeast coast of Scotland. Then I'm going to briefly look at some other case studies from across the UK, and finally think about the importance of the process through which decisions are made about how to find and include communities when we're thinking about the development of offshore wind farms. So, firstly, thinking a bit about why this matters. And there's a concept that academics use called energy justice. And Benjamin Sovacool suggests that this is vital if we want to think of ourselves as being a fair society. But when we're thinking about energy, and it isn't just about fossil fuels, if we're thinking about a transition to clean energy, if we're thinking about offshore wind farms, then we need to be thinking about the distribution of the costs and benefits of those energy developments. And Kirsten Jenkins talks about three main aspects to this concept of energy justice. Firstly, there's distributive justice, making sure that the costs and the benefits are balanced. And this matters because even though clean energy might of course be a very good thing, for those who live nearby or for those who live near the factories where parts are produced or who are now hosting new onshore or offshore infrastructures, actually the benefits of clean energy might be temporarily or spatially removed from them. The proportional reduction in CO2 emissions for someone who lives near an offshore wind farm may be a very small and intangible benefit. So there's a disparity very often between the costs and the benefits of any particular energy development, but certainly also offshore wind farms. So an energy justice approach is trying to appreciate that and take action to address that. The second part of energy justice is recognitional justice, trying to identify those who might be affected and trying to bring them into the process, trying to include them in part of this rebalancing of costs and benefits. And the third part is procedural justice. And by that we mean the processes through which any decisions are made, the way in which people are engaged about decisions that may well affect them. And procedural justice means allowing people to express themselves in a meaningful way. It means having opportunities, creating opportunities that people can say how something matters, how something means to them, why places are important. It means allowing them to do that in ways that are listened to, and ideally taking action as well. So the process through which decisions about energy justice, decisions about balancing costs and benefits really matters. And interestingly, Catherine Gross writes in relation to Australia, but it's a really valid point here, that fairness of process is vital. And that if people feel the process has been fair, if they feel they've had the opportunity to express themselves, if they feel they have been listened to, if they understand how and why decisions were being made, if they feel the process was fair, then they're much more likely to support, or at the very least, not object to the outcomes of that process. So energy justice in these three parts is a key concept that academic researchers have been using to try and understand the implementation of clean energy developments. And there have been various schemes which have tried to address this idea of a distribution, a fair distribution of costs and benefits. But recognizing affected communities is not necessarily straightforward, particularly if we're thinking about offshore developments. Who counts as the community for those community benefits? So if you've been listening to David Rudolph's presentation, and I thoroughly recommend that you do, if you've been listening to David's presentation, you'll know a bit about some of the research that he and I and our colleague have been doing, which is about trying to define communities for offshore projects. And what we found is that definitions of community are very much related to definitions, understandings of benefit, and definitions and understandings of impact, and that the definition of any one of those things depends on the definition of the other two. And I recommend you listen to David's presentation, and he talks in more detail about that. What I'm going to do now is talk a little bit more about what this means in practice. So this is the first case study that I'm going to talk through, and this was some research that I did as part of the European Offshore Wind Deployment Centre, which is a very prestigious offshore wind farm development off the coast of Aberdeen here in Scotland. So off the northeast coast of Aberdeen. Aberdeen is famous for being an oil capital, offshore oil rigs, offshore gas rigs, and now trying to reinvent as a centre for clean, renewable energy. And this is a wee map here of the 11 turbines that make up the Aberdeen offshore wind farm. You can see the little yellow dots there, each one of those is a turbine. And then the cables coming in to a small town called Blackdog on the Aberdeenshire coast, where the substation is located. So these are the 11 turbines for the European Offshore Wind Farm Deployment Centre, or the Aberdeen Bay Wind Farm. And just a few facts about the project. The one that I think is of particular interest here is that there is £150,000 to a community benefit scheme. So every year, Vattenfall, the developer, paying in £150,000 to a community benefit scheme. But how to find that community? And we did a piece of research trying to do exactly that. And building on some of the work that David's talked about, there are different ways of defining that community for this particular offshore wind farm. And that definition depends on the perception of benefit and the perception of impact. So it might be that this is perceived as a really positive project, something great, a way of harnessing the nation's resources, and therefore that the nation should benefit from that. So a positive benefit, positive impact, and that might mean that the community is defined very widely. It could be a whole nation, it could be a whole country, it could be a whole region. And for the Aberdeen Bay offshore wind farm, that might therefore be the whole of Aberdeenshire. In the UK, cities are usually based within broader counties, or in this case, it's called Aberdeenshire. So this is a broader area in which the city of Aberdeen is based. And we did some research talking to people about what they thought about this particular offshore wind farm and the benefits that it might bring. And some of the residents in that area felt very strongly that this was a project which brought benefit for everyone, so the benefits should be shared. Even that the wind farm is something Aberdeen City and Shire should be proud of. So a really positive impact. And the wider the area, the more communities will benefit. So positive impact, great benefits which should be widely shared. So in this understanding, the community is a very wide area. There are other ways of trying to find and identify communities. And a different way is to think much smaller and to think about those who are hosting this particular technology. So here, the community is very narrow and very specifically defined. And the understanding of benefit is perhaps then part of acknowledging that hosting that a particular community is undertaking. It might be part of good citizenship or corporate social responsibility as part of acknowledging and being fair to those communities who are doing this particular job of hosting. So it may be that the impact is seen as being possibly a bit a bit negative, but this is part of fairness and part of rebalancing what's going on with the development. And there were people in the research that we did who very strongly felt that there should be some sort of redress, there should be some sort of benefits for those who lived very near the particular onshore infrastructure. So turbines offshore, cabling to bring the energy onshore at the substation. And for example, a resident here talking about the impact on that particular community. And this is the community. So this is Black Dog, we saw it on the map earlier. This is the area where the onshore substation was built. And these are some of the developers' photographs of the building of that substation. You can see the village of Black Dog just in the background there. And here's the area in which the substation was being built. Here's work in progress. And then here's the final substation built. And as you can see, that's a fairly substantial piece of onshore infrastructure to bring the energy onshore. So it might be that a community is very narrowly defined around that onshore infrastructure. Thirdly, it might be that a community is thought of as being those who are being adversely impacted. So impact here thought of as being quite negative. It could be specific things that are being lost. It could be a more general understanding of amenity being eroded or a visual impact perhaps. So benefit here is about redressing that impact. So a community might be those particular areas who feel that they are having to put up with that impact. And one of the local residents in the research that we did talking about a respect for local communities who are having to feel this impact. The fourth way in which we could define impact and define benefit and define community would be to try and perhaps tackle potential opponents or a skeptical public. So this is a community who use a particular area, and it's about thinking that everyone might be impacted, everyone might be suffering some sort of loss, broadly negative effects, not anything specific that comes with hosting, much more generalized and trying to encourage support for a project. So different ways of defining community, defining benefits, and defining impact. And what happened in Aberdeen? Well, the developer decided to go for a split community benefit scheme. So some benefits for the whole of Aberdeenshire. So if you live in Aberdeenshire, you are eligible to apply for funds for a community project. So across quite a wide region, as part of the ethos of this being a great national resource, and that the benefits should therefore be shared widely by all. But also some money ring-fenced for those particular communities in Black Dog who are now living with the onshore infrastructure. So two parts of the fund, both acknowledging the positive benefits and acknowledging the hosting of those particular communities. And grants are now being issued to people across Aberdeenshire and particularly in Black Dog as well. So this scheme, it's about trying to recognise the communities, those who are affected, trying to distribute some of the benefits that come from this particular wind farm, and trying to involve local people in decision making. So the quotes that I was using in the last few slides, that was part of a series of stakeholder engagement events, public engagement methods to try and find out what local people felt mattered. And I'm just going to briefly talk through some other examples from around the UK that have tried to recognise affected communities, but have done it perhaps in different ways, and have used different ways to distribute benefits and different ways to decide about those. So my first example here is from the Hornsea offshore wind farm, and this is a very wide area for benefits. So as you can see on the map on the right hand side, all those coloured areas are eligible to receive community benefits. So if you have a community project in one of the areas in those different colours, you can apply to the developer for funds for your project. And this is spreading the benefit very widely indeed. And part of the reason it's very pragmatic that that's possible is because this is currently the world's largest wind farm, and the size of any particular wind farm community fund can, of course, vary. So if you have a big wind farm, a big fund, your community can be a lot bigger than if it's a small project that perhaps generates a smaller income. But here, a very wide definition of community. So the opportunity for greater inclusion of people and potentially for larger numbers of people to benefit from the wind farm. But of course, having a large catchment like this might well increase the number of applications that are received. So that may mean a higher number of rejections, just in terms of the number of applications that are made. And it may also loosen the connection between where people live and the particular project. So it may mean that people live many, many miles from the offshore wind farm, and there isn't necessarily that same connection, that same sense of bringing in benefit from this project. And it may be that those who feel themselves to be more directly impacted don't feel that they've been recognised and don't feel that they've had the costs and benefits of being near a project redressed or balanced for them. Another way in which communities have been defined is through thinking very specifically about those hosts for the onshore infrastructure, not about the turbines offshore, but just about those communities hosting the onshore substations. So here's an example of that. This is the Greater Gabbard offshore wind farm off the coast of East Anglia, and that's off the east coast of England. And you can see in the second map here, so there's a map of the wind farm, a map of the cable, and the only residents who are able to apply for community funding are those who live within the town boundaries of Leiston and Sizewell. So just those communities, very specific way of determining a community for this particular community benefit fund. Similarly, for the London Array Community Benefit Fund, the project is offshore, the cable comes in, it comes into a place called Cleeve Hill, and only those who are within that parish, which is a local designation, only those within that particular area are eligible to apply for funds for community benefit. So just those hosts of the onshore infrastructure. And there's a third example here. So this is the Dudgeon offshore wind farm off the coast of East Anglia, again, a bit further north. So you can see location in the UK. Here's all the offshore turbines, and then a long cable, so 31 miles of onshore cabling. And it's just residents who live alongside that onshore cable route who are eligible to apply for funds for a community project. So nothing to do with the offshore turbines, just residents who live alongside that onshore cabling. And this is an interesting approach to take in all of these projects. It's a very specific approach. It's particularly targeted on the places that host the onshore infrastructure. And perhaps it is in those places that change will be most immediate, most obvious, and most tangible. And it does mean that because the community has been very narrowly defined, that there's the potential for appreciable impact. If the benefit isn't being spread across a wide area, it's just being very narrowly focused on a particular area, then it might be possible to really see change, to actually have a positive impact through the funds that are being spent. This focus on hosting is an interesting one, and it does have a very distinct geographical sense to it. It's just around that substation or that cable, but it does mean that others may feel unrecognised or unacknowledged, even if they do feel affected. So coastal communities looking out onto the turbines may themselves feel affected, but if they're not part of those hosts for onshore infrastructure, then they're not included. So there are other ways in which the communities for community benefit funds have been defined. And one of those ways is to just try and find the geographically closest communities by quite literally drawing a line on a map. So this is an example of the Tees wind farm. This is off the Tees Valley off the northeast coast of England. And you can see a sort of an orange line. That's the area of benefit. So if you live in that area, you are eligible to apply for community funds. And it's quite a sharp line. So if you are one side of the line, you're eligible, the other side of the line, you're not. And this line cuts across different wards, different parishes, different ways of defining that community. So you can see the different dots on that community, those designate different wards. This line cuts through those. It's just the geographically closest, it mirrors the coastline, the geographically closest places to the coast. And this perhaps follows the rationale of trying to account for change and suggesting that those who are nearest the coast will see or experience that change the most. And this is a community which is larger than just those who might be hosting, but not as large, clearly, as the whole region. And there are other examples here as well. So this is the Gwynter Moor offshore wind farm off the coast of North Wales. And again, here, there is a line on a map. So you can see the red areas are where the offshore turbines are. The red line coming in is the cabling, and then a line drawn to demarcate the closest area to the coast. And this is an interesting way of designating the community. It allows some amount of control because you can determine where that line is drawn, how near or far away from the coast it's drawn. There's no set restrictions, so there's an opportunity to do that however one might like. For example, if there were particularly populous towns or centres of population along the coast, you could choose to either include or not include them in the way in which the line was drawn. And proximity, this drawing the closest line, does give a sense of providing benefits to those who might be experiencing change. Perhaps it does have an implication that that's going to be negative change. And perhaps the drawing of that line might always be seen as somewhat arbitrary because it doesn't follow any pre-existing lines, because it is just being drawn in terms of proximity and closeness to the coast. It may be that those who are just the wrong side of that line feel that the drawing of it is unfair. There's another way in which communities have been defined. It's similar, but it uses existing community boundaries. So, for example, this is the Real Flats offshore wind farm, again off the coast of North Wales, just a little bit further along from the Gwynter Moor offshore wind farm. And the area in blue here is wards, which again is a political division, pre-existing wards that are closest to the coast. So this isn't drawing a line on a map, this is identifying wards that have a coastal border and including those to be eligible to apply for community benefit. And using pre-existing boundaries like this perhaps gives an independent sense or an official sense to the decision. And it also won't be news to people. Everyone knows in which ward they live. That's a pre-existing classification. And the fund is merely following that existing line. It does mean, again, that there's some control over the population that might be included in terms of the number of wards that might be included, but less so than just drawing a line on a map. But selecting wards that have a coastal border might perhaps fit in with the ethos of a project. Coastal border for a coastal project, a project offshore. And it means that the drawing of this boundary, the determination of the boundaries, is about having a connection with the coast. It's not about nearness per se. It's not about same as a geographical line. If you're near, you're in that line. It's about connection with the coast. But it's not perfect. And some parts of the wards that are included may be further away from the coast than other parts that aren't included. So you can perhaps see on the map that in the bottom right of the map, there's a sort of a slightly odd-shaped ward, number 14, the ward is called Gelly. And you could be living in the south of that ward, and that ward only has a tiny part of a coastal border, a very, very narrow part of that ward touches the coast. You could be living in the south of the ward Gelly and be much further away from the coast than someone living in one of the wards that aren't included. So again, if you are in a ward that's not included, you might not find that this particular approach is particularly fair. Okay, so far I've been talking about different ways in which communities have been defined, different ways in which lines have been drawn, different ways in which the understanding of community has varied. What I'm going to mention now to bring this to a close is talking a bit about the procedure for deciding this. So all of these different projects have been about trying to address this issue of the distribution, the fair distribution of costs and benefits from these offshore wind farm projects, trying to bring some benefit to those communities nearby, however nearby is defined and however community is defined. And all of them have been about trying to recognise communities, but again, doing that in very different ways, recognising who might be affected and therefore who should benefit quite differently, from a very specific focus on hosting to a much broader understanding of benefit and community being much more widely spread. The other part of justice that we were talking about at the start was procedure. So distributing costs and benefits, recognising those affected, but procedural justice as well. And community benefit schemes do have the opportunity to distribute those costs and benefits that come from offshore wind farm projects, to recognise those communities. But what matters is engaging the community in trying to determine who might be the relevant community for this particular project. So trying to speak to the community, key groups, key stakeholders, the particular organisations, community representatives, local people, about who should be included, which area should be included, how should community be defined? Should it be people who use the sea for work or for leisure? Should it be communities on shore? How should those divisions, those boundaries be drawn? And also communities can be asked about who should benefit. So if there is going to be a fund, should it be just for community groups? Should it be supporting youth projects? Should it be providing community facilities? How should that money be best spent? And who should be eligible for it? Should it just be those who are trying to serve the community in some way? And should it be focused around particular topics? So some of the wind farms that I've talked about so far have had quite a specific remit about trying to channel funding towards projects that have a particular legacy or that address environmental aims or that provide some sort of facilities for communities. So communities can be engaged, and this is part of procedural justice, involving people in decisions that affect them, engaging them in meaningful ways, and taking action wherever possible on what they say. And I have a couple of very quick examples just to finish off of exactly that, about engaging communities, about who should be included, how those boundaries should be drawn. So this map here is the Gwyntermore offshore wind farm off the coast of North Wales. This one we saw earlier, this one has that line of geographical proximity. But what's really interesting is that there was public consultation, which was done, offering different lines. So different zones moving further and further back from the coast. And this was opened up to public consultation. Zone 1 and Zone 2 were the most popular lines in public consultation. And to the bottom of Zone 2 is the line that's being used. So engaging a community to try and help inform and make decisions about who counts as the affected, as the relevant community for that offshore project. I mentioned earlier on the Aberdeen Bay offshore wind farm. And again, this was extensive consultation with key organisations, key stakeholders, key groups on and offshore, and local people. And the findings were used to determine how the boundary was drawn and who should benefit. So that two-part project funding, the way in which community was defined as the whole of Aberdeenshire and the local hosts at Black Dog, that came from the public consultations, and that's the form of the community benefit fund that's being used. So final slide, just a quick summary of what I've been talking about today. Community benefits matter if we're trying to think about achieving a just transition to clean energy futures. And of course, community benefits can come in a host of different ways. They may well be, as in the schemes that I've been talking about, funds that are paid into a community for communities to use in whatever way they think might be most useful, or a fund that communities can apply to for funding for their particular project. But of course, they don't have to be just about monetary benefits. They might be about provision of community facilities. They might be about apprenticeships. They might be about training schemes, education. There's a range of different sorts of benefits that can come. But if we're thinking about a just transition, that does mean trying to balance the costs and benefits of doing so. And those who are affected can be recognised, even though we might be talking about projects that are miles offshore. There will be people who are affected and who can be recognised, and the costs and benefits can be balanced. And of course, this is part of ongoing engagement and consultation and working alongside communities. So the research that we've done very strongly suggests that engagement should be early, it should be ongoing, it should be meaningful, and it should take action. And engagement about community benefit funds and definition of communities is just part of that ongoing project of consultation. And there are different ways, certainly, to determine and to deliver benefits. And each of these will have different implications for the distribution of costs and benefits and for recognising those communities. And this isn't to say that there's one perfect solution. Every way in which a community is defined will be better or worse for some people. If a community is defined as a whole nation, then those who are local may feel unrecognised and the benefit will be spread very thin. If the benefit is targeted very specifically, it might be great for a few people, but not so good for others. So there's not necessarily one correct way to do this. The thing that does matter when trying to find the best and most appropriate way for any particular project is to engage with that community and to find out what's most appropriate, what's most meaningful, and what matters in that particular place. So that was all I wanted to say today. These are just some of the references for some of the work that I've been talking about and for some of the particular projects. And I really look forward to meeting some of you, to speaking to some of you when we have the webinar next week. But that's all for now. Thanks very much.